Welcome to this meeting of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. Today we have a panel discussion on a topic that is perhaps given less importance than it merits, the potential of culture as a unifying and rehabilitating force in damaged and divided societies. Development efforts in the wake of disasters, either man-made or natural, inevitably and rightly focus on people's immediate material needs. But a sense of shared heritage can be a powerful factor in generating the unity and cohesion that helps societies to bind together in adversity and act collectively. And the breadth of our audience today suggests that this is perhaps more widely recognised than it is acted upon. In addition to participants from the UK, we have people joining us from India, Oman, Chile, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, Norway, Spain, France, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, Tajikistan, and the United States. Welcome to you all. Internet shopping is offering a lot of discounts at the moment, and this event is also something of a bargain. I asked Jonathan Ryder if he might be available, and he came back with what was in effect a buy one, get two free offer, bringing in colleagues with a range of different skills and backgrounds, but all focused on the role of culture and heritage. Let me introduce our three panelists. They are Jonathan Ryder, who studied archaeology at Nottingham and Oxford. After some pioneering expeditions by raft in Afghanistan and Pakistan, he settled down to work for a political polling company in the UK. That must have been quite a transition, but he soon thought better of it and embarked instead on a research career in Afghanistan. That led him first to the Aga Khan Foundation and then to UNESCO, for whom he managed conservation projects at the World Heritage Site in Bamiyan, work about which he spoke to the RSAA 2 years ago. More recently, with our second panellist, Daniel Skillings, Jonathan founded Aleph Strategies, a research consultancy specialising in conflict and post-conflict situations. Daniel has 12 years of experience in evaluation in countries including Somalia, Afghanistan, Kenya, Indonesia, Rwanda and South Sudan, and in fields as diverse as education, agriculture, private sector development, media, governance and culture. Before launching Aleph Strategies, Daniel was a director for Altai Consulting, and before that was the programme coordinator for the Preventive Diplomacy Initiative at the East-West Institute in Brussels. He has degrees in international relations from the University of Kent at Canterbury and in international business and entrepreneurism from the University of Victoria in Canada. And it is from Victoria that he is joining us today. It's only 7 o'clock in the morning there, so we're allowing him to speak second rather than first. Our third panellist, Flore, is a social entrepreneur who read history at King's College London, followed by a dual master's from the Paris Institute of Political Studies and the London School of Economics. Over the last 8 years, Flore has built an expertise in designing and implementing cultural development programmes in conflict and post-conflict countries. Starting out with the World Bank and the United Nations, she went on to work for the Turquoise Mountain Foundation in Afghanistan before becoming their deputy programme director in Jordan. In 2016, she co-founded Ishkar, a social enterprise that seeks to create opportunities for artists, artisans and local guides in parts of the world that have been cut off by global events. In January 2018, Flore was given a Forbes 30 Under 30 award for her work in social enterprise. At the bottoms of your screens, you should have a Q&A button. Please use it to put forward any questions at any time during the webinar. We can't guarantee, of course, to answer every question that is raised, but the panel and I will do our best. And if you would like to put a question to a specific panel member, please put their name at the top of your question. And with that, I will hand over to Jonathan.
Thank you very much. Please bear with me while I get my presentation up. Hopefully you will see a picture of Bamiyan. Thank you very much for the introduction, Michael. Afghanistan has a very rich cultural heritage spanning millennia. And I know from previous talks I've given at the RSAA, this is a very well-informed audience. So in the interest of time, you'll have to forgive me for skipping over an historical introduction. Our interest today is the role of heritage in rebuilding countries after conflict or natural disasters. Now, as Michael said, I've worked in Afghanistan for a number of years, working with the Aga Khan and UNESCO on cultural heritage programs. And in my current role as well, I've been back a few times to evaluate cultural heritage programs. But my real interest and our focus of my short presentation now is going to be on the role that cultural tourism can play in rebuilding economies and reshaping negative media-fueled narratives. Now, this is more than just a professional interest. Some of you may recall the expeditions I undertook to the source of the Oxus in Afghanistan and down the Hunza River in Pakistan. And I'll be drawing on these journeys as well as my current work, where I've seen firsthand the transformative effect of international and domestic tourism on local communities and the environment. First to the Wakhan Corridor. Now, the Wakhan Corridor is no stranger to foreign tourists. People have been traveling here for centuries. Its appeal is obviously its remoteness, its unspoiled culture of nomadic pastoralism, and the potential for cultural and ecological tourism here is quite extraordinary. There are tomb complexes, settlements, petroglyphs, the Kyrgyz communities themselves that live up there, not to mention the wildlife. There's no infrastructure, there are no roads, no power lines, and no phone reception. But with this remoteness obviously comes limited access to healthcare and education, and of course very low life expectancy. But tourism has the potential to alleviate these difficulties if managed correctly. Sadly, a lot of the negative media coverage that we see for Afghanistan has precluded against a lot of foreign travelers coming here today. And of course, the security situation in the country means that people from other parts of Afghanistan struggle to make it into the Wakhan Corridor. By contrast, just across the border in Pakistan, the Hunza Valley is rich in archaeological and historical sites and national parks, and it's been sort of fully opened up to the public for a number of years now, largely thanks to the creation of the Karakoram Highway in the 1960s, and particularly in light of recent upgrades it received in the last few years. Cultural tourism, domestic tourism, has absolutely flourished here, and I think that the annual visitor numbers today are counted in their millions, bringing huge amounts of revenue to local residents. But there are some cautionary lessons from Pakistan. The flood of domestic tourism has brought or carries a social and environmental cost. Picnic spots are awash with litter, roads are crowded, and there's a lot of noise pollution too. There's also a fair amount of damage, environmental damage, associated with the rapid expansion of urban areas as new hotels, cafes, guest houses, and restaurants spring up on every corner. So while many people in the local community are clearly benefiting enormously from the influx of tourists and the revenue that that brings, some people lament what they see as the erosion of their habitat, their landscape, their environment, and even their traditional ways of life. Back in Afghanistan, the current uncertain, let's say, political climate and volatile security situation have pushed tourism very far down the agenda, as you might expect. But there are some initiatives that are trying to lay the groundwork for future development, notably in Bamiyan, where UNESCO is developing what it calls a cultural master plan to ensure that cultural heritage is protected and promoted at the same time. And this raises its own unique sets of complexities. The Buddha statues, as many of you may know, were a very small, albeit iconic, part of the cultural landscape in Bamiyan, much of which is inscribed on the list of World Heritage. Now, this is a really positive move as it helps to raise awareness and visibility of these sites around the world. And it also instills a great sense of national and local pride in these monuments. But it also confers considerable responsibility on the government and on local communities to protect and conserve the ancient monuments. And this wouldn't be such an issue if it weren't for the fact that the site is located more or less smack bang in the middle of a modern, thriving, bustling, growing urban centre, as you can see from the image below. The Buddha Cliffs are a small part of it. There are all sorts of other sites across the city and across the valley, and people are living in and amongst them. Now, this is one part of Afghanistan where culture is front and centre of people's minds. Local residents in the international development community are all engaged in activities to support the protection of cultural heritage here. It's also comparatively safe, meaning that domestic tourists do come here as well. Cultural heritage is widely celebrated. There's the Silk Road Festival that happens, I think, annually. I don't know if it happened last year, but it certainly happened for a number of years, where there's music and traditional games. And Bamiyan itself was nominated as the SAARC Cultural Capital in 2016. SAARC stands for South Asia Area for Regional Cooperation, for those who don't know. Getting things right in Bamiyan then really creates a blueprint for how tourism could be developed elsewhere in the country. But the challenge for government and policymakers is to ensure that local communities in Bamiyan and elsewhere, those who live in and amongst heritage sites, are given the physical and regulatory space needed to engage in trade, in commerce, in house building, all the things commonly associated with any growing town, without negatively impacting the cultural landscape itself and therefore the potential for attracting foreign or domestic tourists. Now, in the past in Bamiyan, there has been tension between local residents who understandably want to upgrade their houses, who want to open hotels or cafes or engage in trade and just generally cash in on the potential for tourism. And the local government, who recently bulldozed a road through a 14th century Islamic cemetery to connect the governor's house to a lower part of the city. And of course, UNESCO, who pretty much wants to preserve the status quo. But accepting that development of any kind needs to be led by local communities raises a number of quite complex and ethical, practical questions. What if local communities want a road to be built through an ancient site? What if they want to restore ancient sites using modern materials such as plastic or concrete? And what, for that matter, if they want to build a giant neon hotel overlooking the Buddha niches, as you can see in my photograph below? Who owns the cultural landscape? And who, for that matter, owns the culture? Whose culture is it anyway? I'm going to leave those questions, those are the big questions, dangling in the hope that we can pick them up in our discussion time at the end. Finally, there are very many thousands of cultural sites across Afghanistan that are falling into disrepair through lack of investment. And so this is a call for more money to be invested in this kind of thing. We've seen billions of dollars poured into misplaced development initiatives over the years, and very few return the same kinds of immediate, tangible benefits to local communities that cultural investment does. But I think I'm going to leave it there and hand over to Daniel.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Let me just share my screen. Very good. So now we are crossing the globe, and from Central Asia, we're moving over to Indonesia. And the first thing I should mention that I'm taking you through the story of a post-earthquake recovery project that was sponsored and implemented by UNESCO with a number of local partners. And I'm taking this from an evaluation standpoint. And I must say, I felt quite privileged to be in Lombok. For those of you that don't know, it's the sister island to the east of Bali. It's a more famous island, but a little less, lower key in terms of tourism, and quite beautiful. I felt very privileged. In my 12 years, I'm not sure I've been to such a paradise on earth as this was. And as you can see, I saw many sunsets just like this in the picture on the right. On the left, what the project was focused on was the intangible cultural heritage elements of weaving, which is quite important to the island, in particular to female groups. Here we have 2 young students learning as part of this program. The weaving has been passed down from generation to generation. It is part of rituals, ceremonies, and now more recently part of their economic livelihoods. More broadly, myself and Flore, in fact, were part of a team of evaluators that did a global review of UNESCO's culture in emergencies, which included both conflict and natural disasters. And this was one of the case studies that was chosen as part of our fieldwork. And I, as I mentioned, had the opportunity to travel to Lombok in January this year. So a little bit of context. A series of 3 earthquakes struck the island late July and early August of 2018, the largest of which was a 7.0 magnitude. And as you can see, we had a number of fatalities, a lot of injuries, and even more displaced. They had the usual damage to housing infrastructure and, of course, a loss of livelihoods. Tourism came to a halt. And then, of course, the humanitarian response came in through the government, through international organizations, local grassroots organizations, focused on, and rightfully so, food, shelter, water, sanitation, and security, first and foremost. But there's always the broader question of what role culture can play. Should it be part of the initial response, the immediate response to a humanitarian intervention in a post-disaster setting? Or should it be in the early recovery phase a little further down the road? And that's a question I'd like to pose to the group when we discuss further as well. When should an international organization intervene? We certainly have our views, and I think this case study brings to light in which was a success of how UNESCO and their partners intervened. What was the project? Well, traditional weavers. I mentioned that it's native to the island. It's part of their economic livelihoods. This project did focus on early recovery instead of response. They had a seat at the table when discussing with the government as to when they should intervene, but they let the humanitarian workers ensure the security of the people, the food, and shelter was in place before intervening themselves. We've seen this in other cases where culture tries to come in the case of Mali, for example, where you come in too early, people have lost loved ones, they've lost their livelihoods, their homes no longer exist, and consultants such as myself or those from UNESCO come in and say, but what about culture? And sometimes this can be seen as too early in the process. That was not the case here. And in fact, UNESCO and their partners came in a little further down the line, 4 months after the island had been secured the basic needs of the people, so they can start the process of supporting the weaving groups on the island. Another interesting point of this project was that it focused on the intangible elements of culture as opposed to built culture. And this is something that UNESCO, for one, and other organizations such as ALIF are working on, to say that intangible cultural elements such as music, whether it's in this case weaving, arts and crafts, can be used as a tool for community recovery. And in this case, this was an important part of the social cohesion and the ability of togetherness for these female groups to return to normalcy after the impact of the earthquake. A couple of other great points here that I really think we should highlight from an evaluator standpoint was the fact that UNESCO and their partners engaged with the community leaders in the beginning to build this project together. This seems like an obvious point, but it's not often that it happens in international development in reality, in which you come in and you discuss on a needs assessment basis to say, what do you need? How can we help you? How can we best support your community? Oftentimes, top-down management dictates how these things are done, and international development is imposed on communities as opposed to asking a simple question of, how can we help? They did certain things like infrastructure support, materials. They had a number of different trainings about social media and marketing and digitization to try to improve, not only bring back the status quo of the livelihoods of these individuals on the island, selling their traditional motifs to tourists or others domestically in Indonesia, but also to try to improve it by showing them how they could benefit and leverage the power of Instagram, for example, or Twitter or WhatsApp onto how they could sell these motifs to lands further away. They organized a number of public exhibitions, and they brought together communities of people from across Indonesia to celebrate these traditional clothing materials. But the main point of this, and what the real essence of this success story, was the fact that they were able to use this project as a means for psychosocial support. It brought these communities together. It helped them recover from a traumatic experience in which loved ones were lost. It gave them a forum in which to speak together. And it's a successful example of how intangible cultural heritage can be used as a tool for community recovery, resilience, and overcoming some traumatic events. Trauma healing here was front and center, and we really got a lot of good feedback from the individuals at the government level, as well as the participants themselves on the island, that smiles returned to their faces. As I mentioned, the project intervened at the right time. It didn't come too early. It was appropriate to be an early response further down the line, as opposed to trying to have culture front and center at the response stage. The project really succeeded in empowering women. After the project, many of the women that were involved, the young girls and women who were the weavers in these communities, felt empowered to build their own business cases, to go to government to ask for more funding, to post certain things on Instagram. They learned how to create dresses. They learned how to sell items at local markets. That opened up a whole new livelihoods channels for these individuals. Very importantly, it reinforced the belief in their weaving culture. A lot of, UNESCO's power in this case is its convening power and its ability to bring attention. And through UNESCO's work, they're really able to reinforce the belief of this is very important. It had been lost somewhat in the younger generation, and this reinvigorated the essence of how important this is. So much so that the local governments now have a Thursday in which each week on a Thursday, they must wear the local motifs, the tenan bayan or the tenan ringasela, as they call it locally, as part of their wardrobe for the day. And finally, I'd like to highlight that this was a cost-effective project. It was all completed for $70,000 US, including staffing, all the different types of activities over a 1.5 year period. It doesn't need to be expensive. It can be something that is as simple as bringing communities together and doing something at the grassroots level that can be quite effective. Unlike other forms in which lots of money is poured into building and reconstructing built heritage, intangible cultural heritage elements can be done quite cost effectively. A few questions I'd like to pour back to the group as I close and pass on to my colleague Flore. The one I mentioned is about the role of intangible cultural heritage in community recovery. I would like to hear from others that have been involved, whether or not they have had those experiences of success in which such culture can be used as a tool for community recovery. And the second is regarding the role of international organizations. A lot can be said about when international organizations should intervene. I've made a case here today of a successful example when it has happened well, in my opinion. But what is the role of international organizations in culture and emergencies? Should they leave it to local governments and local grassroots officers, the private sector, tourism to engage? And what should the elites and UNESCO's do in this regard? Thank you very much. Flore, over to you.
Thank you, Dan. I'm just going to share my screen. Yeah. So I come, and I'm going to revert to some of the points that Dan and Jonathan have made during their presentation. So Ishkar, I've set up Ishkar in 2016 when I came back from Afghanistan. And it was mainly a way to sort of challenge perception of fragile state and strengthening trade through sort of a multi-channel business, social enterprise. And we started by looking at objects and craftsmanship, so the intangible heritage part of things. And then we, over the last 3 years, have created lots of events presenting documentaries, book launch around the countries that we're working in. And then more recently, bringing travelers to Afghanistan or places that had been covered in the media from quite a negative angle. And I think, so I come here more as a sort of the private sector, or less as a traveler or as a consultant, but more what we've seen when we started working directly with craftsmen, guides, and people involved in and mainly focused on the Afghan economic sector. The importance, I think, is seeing in conflicts, a lot of the issues are ideological, some issues are economical. So when you look at post sort of building a society post-conflict, or even a society in conflict like Afghanistan, what's important is providing people with means of support, providing people with economic resources, but also providing people with a sense of belonging to a community, and that creates this social cohesion element. But really what's important is, above anything else, is the economic support. If we look at Afghanistan, so this was a photo shoot in the 70s, a Vogue photo shoot in Afghanistan, when Afghanistan was still a center for tourism, a center of trade, and was just very popular amongst travelers. And when we started Ishkar, we visited Ghulam Saki, who is still a glassblower in northern Afghanistan, in Herat. In the 70s, you had around 12 workshops, constantly blowing glasses for the local economy, of course, and local markets, but also for tourists going through Herat on either the hippie trail or generally through Central Asia. And when we visited him, what we realized was there were lots of stock of glasses that hadn't been really sold. He didn't really understood how he could sell abroad, but we knew that these would work really well in the international markets. So we started off by buying 5,000 glasses from him, which we thought, if we don't sell them, that's going to be basically presents for Christmas, birthdays, Mother's Days for a very long time. But luckily, our hunch was the right one, and we realized that what was really important was developing the demand for these products. So the supply and the creation and the innovation behind these particular products exists in places like Afghanistan, and it's very rich, but it's just the link to the markets has been destroyed by the conflict, and it's still very difficult to get things in and out of a place like Herat. And what we really thought was the economic recovery element. What's important is usually when you look at craftsmanship across the world, a bit less so now in Europe, in in the US, where the crafts movement has taken it's more of a trend than anything else. And it's very slick and curated. In most places, when you say craftsmanship, people think about that. So they think about products that are packaged in a way that's potentially not very appealing, where you buy because you think that's more of a charitable gesture that you're doing, and it's not because you actually need the products. And what's important is not only of course, the economic recovery element and actually being able to trade with craftsmen, but it's also being able to put them exactly on the same level as a French ceramicist, as a British woodworker. And so that's how we took on ourselves to try to shift people's perception and really putting everyone on the same level. And that allowed as well for prices to be higher, to pay craftsmen the actual money that they were supposed to get and that they're supposed to get for the incredible work and amount of time that they're spending in these products. So for example, if we go on talking about a specific example of an artisan we're working with, so Saida, working as an artisan and is being supported by Turquoise Mountain in Kabul. She is now one of our main designer, and is her pieces that she designed for us and not just made for us are the most well sold item on the website. And these are the pieces. What we thought was important was really, again, just like any international maker, French, English, Chilean, being able to combine these amazing skills with marketing it as a product of value. So we did a collaboration with a French influencer that has around sort of 3,000 followers on Instagram, to be able to promote these products exactly like other products. And this is really important because we think that the livelihood element of intangible cultural heritage can either stay at a small level and trying to really push the local market, which is great, and usually it works. And especially in a place like Bamiyan, as Jonathan was saying, there are some tourists going there. It is a place where people could buy objects like the one that Saida makes. But we also thought it's important to constantly put people on the same level and using the same marketing tools, using exactly the same tools that we have to be able to promote what they do. It will lead to more sales for the artisan, but also a feeling of being part of a general movement, being part of a movement where their culture is being shared, where perception about their culture is being challenged, and generally a renewed pride in what they're doing. I know that Jonathan touched upon tourism, but it's in the same line basically that we sort of worked around smaller groups being able to go to Afghanistan and being guided by amazing people there that have been doing research for UNESCO, have been working on these amazing programs, and being able to tell their stories about what they think culture in a place like Bamiyan should look like. So yes, now opening it up to Richard.
Thank you to all three of you for those very succinct and beautifully illustrated contributions. Our priority today is on discussion, and to help us get that started, I'm turning immediately to Richard Wilding. Richard, who some of you may know, is a London-based photographer and filmmaker who specialises in the documentation of cultural identity, heritage, archaeology and costume, particularly in the Middle East. He's currently working on long-term projects in Iraqi Kurdistan, in Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and he has previously spoken to the RSAA about his work in Iraqi Kurdistan. He was quite literally the first person to register for this webinar, and I'm very pleased that he has agreed to start off the questions for us and to welcome him back to the RSAA. Richard, you have the microphone.
Thank you, Michael. Can you all hear me?
Well, I certainly can.
Okay, and thank you for those three wonderful presentations by the panelists. I suppose I'd like to make just a general point, and I have a couple of questions queued up for you. My first thought listening to the discussion was that really, when it comes to cultural heritage, that the larger organizations, the UNESCOs and such, can be, I feel, rather unwieldy, bureaucratic and slow. And I've always felt in this arena that it's much healthier to develop a infrastructure of smaller organizations and micro businesses, and that somehow that might create a more healthy and nuanced response. And that's certainly where I'm trying to direct most of my work at the moment. I had two questions for the panelists. The first was that I think that as people working in this area, we are rather walking a tightrope and having to tread very carefully in and around sensitive issues and accusations such as Orientalism and cultural appropriation, post-colonialism, and so on. And I wondered what criticism the panelists may have faced from different sides of this, from academia, from the media, from local populations. I wonder how you three handle these sensitivities. And then the second question was really regarding the current situation with coronavirus and the way that the world is changing and will change. And I wonder, in regards to funding, what difference the panelists think the coming economic downturn will make to the feasibility of their projects now and in the future. Will Western governments and NGOs be able to continue with their funding? Will the increased cost and difficulty in travel make it possible to continue this dialogue with post-conflict regions? And obviously the effect that the coming changes will mean for cultural tourism, which is obviously even now really in its infancy in some of the regions that we're dealing with. And I wondered what the thoughts were from the three panelists on that issue.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I'm going to leave it to the panelists themselves to figure out how they respond to that. The same will be true of subsequent questions. I will lob in questions myself where they have been posted in the Q&A by participants, but I will leave the business of brokering the responses to the three of them. Jonathan, go ahead, please.
Thanks very much. And thanks, Richard, for those questions and observations. They're spot on, I should say, and I agree with all of that. I think the question of cultural appropriation, of accusations of Orientalism, are things that hopefully any conscientious worker in this field is acutely aware of. Whether or not I've handled that personally successfully, I don't know. I certainly try not to masquerade in sort of local clothing if I can avoid it. But speaking from the sort of perspective of my work with UNESCO, those issues raised their heads at a reasonably strategic and sort of policy-based level. When it came to questions of how to inscribe sites like Bamiyan on the World Heritage List. In order to get onto these lists, they have to both conserve the authenticity and the integrity of the historical site. And those two words mean very different things to different schools, you like. In the West, traditionally that has meant it must be preserved in a manner that is entirely physically, not even reminiscent, is using the same materials that the original structure had been built out of, using processes such as anastylosis, where you use the same materials again and again. You basically rebuild the thing in the state of conservation or preservation that it's found in. You don't rebuild anything. Whereas, and I'm characterizing these things in very, very, very broad terms. There are schools of thought, particularly further east, particularly somewhere like Japan, for instance, which is very active on the kind of UNESCO scene, where things get rebuilt. The integrity and the authenticity of a site is as much about how it is used and how communities engage with and interact with that site as it is about the physical properties of that site itself. As an example, a temple can be 1,000 years old, but the materials that it's built out of are never more than about 20 years old, because it's designed a bit like a Jenga structure. You can pull out or push out individual beams and refit them again using exactly the same tools and techniques. So the thing itself is very new, but it is a thing that has looked like and been engaged with and interacted with as a temple in the same way for many thousands of years. So that's a discussion that is continuing to be had at a broad level within UNESCO. And also, I think, as sort of an intermediary for that, is that the Bamiyan site itself is inscribed as a cultural landscape, not just as a cultural site. And that means that it's about all of the myriad ways of engaging with culture, tangible and intangible, as a deliberate attempt to not force any kind of preconceived notion of what, or one-dimensional notion of what culture is and what it means for people. I appreciate there's only part of your question, but I know that the others probably want to chip in too.
Thank you.
I think and I'm going to go from more of a micro perspective, as Jonathan went on the more policy level macro perspective. We've been criticized many times on basically adapting skills, adapting materials to design that were sort of Western designs, or because there were designs that actually could sell on the market, for example, and could sell in the markets that we were in. So we had lots of back and forth about that, around how we could actually respond and be quite transparent about why we were doing that, but also making sure that now a lot of the objects that we have on our website and a lot of the objects that we're developing with the partners have the craftsman is the main one leading on the design element, and we're just sending sort of more feedback about, you know, colors that would work or general trends in the market, so it can be sold on the markets. Also, what's important is the critics help you to build a stronger narrative, and it's important to be slightly on the edge on these things, just because everything changes all the time, that you need to be aware of what people can criticize you for. And that's also why we constantly include the artisan in the writing on the text, for example, about what we tell, like what story we tell about the product, what story we tell about their own story, and how we communicate generally on Instagram, on the website, everywhere. So all the text is being shared, and they are usually the one writing the text, which is helping us in defining what is the narrative around what we're doing.
Yeah, and thank you, Richard. I think one thing I could add to that, your first point before your questions regarding international organizations versus working through the grassroots and at the local level, I think that's spot on. And in fact, through our research on UNESCO's culture and emergencies globally, what we found is that you're right to a certain degree regarding the bureaucracy, how slowly they move, but they're also very aware of that. And they do have a role to play, certainly in terms of bringing to the forefront the 6 cultural conventions, the standard setting instruments, and of course the agenda setting, the global convening power that they have. In the particular example in Lombok, I do not think that the weaving groups would have got the attention that they well deserve without UNESCO's name and brand as part of the project. What UNESCO did successfully in this regard, I won't say they do this all the time, but in this regard, in this particular project, they did work with local NGOs and organizations on the ground that were better suited to provide the services and to improve the conditions for the weaving groups on the ground. So that was quite important. And I think with that balance of international exposure from the top end from UNESCO and working on the ground with the right partners, remaining operationally dynamic when they put projects to the forefront, that can be a winning formula. If I shift to your question regarding COVID, I must say that we earn our living at LF Strategies by being there in person in Afghanistan, South Sudan, Somalia, etc. So no doubt we've had to reconfigure how we work as researchers in this field. Obviously, we're doing a lot of new things such as this, the new reality of Zoom meetings, Google Meets, wherever it might be. It cannot replace the in-person touch and feel you get from those interviews that happen in the country, being in those communities, interviewing those groups, such as the weaving groups in Lombok, feel for their context and how they operate. But we're doing our best to try to overcome that in the immediate term with the type of technology that we're using today. But no doubt, we hope to return to the field as quickly as possible, because you lose that sense and touch if you can't be there.
I mean,
go for it, John.
Well, I was just going to pick up very quickly on the COVID-19 point. Somebody asked a question during the presentations about that. Ingen, thank you for that question. We were asked, what impact has COVID-19 had on the cultural heritage sites that we've mentioned in Afghanistan? What effect has the travel ban had? And obviously, not being there ourselves, it's very hard to determine what that might be, and particularly in sites where things like visitor numbers aren't recorded anyway. It's very hard to say. I suspect for places like Bamiyan, I know that they record visitor numbers, of course, to places like Bandi Amir and the national park there. After the event, it'll probably be clear that those numbers have dropped quite significantly. Speaking to colleagues in UNESCO a couple of days ago, their observation, their perception of activity in Bamiyan is that it has dropped significantly. And I think that the travel bans will be affecting people, in equal part across the country. But for those sites that don't have really any tourism infrastructure built around them, that are remote in any case or insecure in any case, I don't think that the COVID-19 pandemic will have a huge impact on them, as they are largely unvisited anyway.
And joining Jonathan on that, because Ishkar was supposed to bring a group of 8 travelers in May to Bamiyan, and then another group in September. So we'll see if we're able to do that. So we're constantly in communication with the guides there in Bamiyan, and well, there are basically no more tourists. The travel, it's not just the international companies that are not running anymore, it's also the local Khmer, which is the local plane going from Kabul to Bamiyan, that is not running. So now what they're doing is helping WFP in food distribution. There are lots of things happening, which means that they're still involved in the community at large and are doing other things than being guides. But it has an impact on, and at least for us, as a sort of nascent travel company, we are not funded by we're not a charity, we're not funded by any donors, we're basically being paid by travelers. So if they can't travel, we can't be paid, and we can't pay the guides. So it has a direct impact on the tourist structure in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. I'd like to put in a question of my own at this point. Much of my career has been spent dealing with conflict-affected countries, one kind and another. And indeed, I'm very familiar with Turquoise Mountain Foundation from my own time in Afghanistan. There is always a potential criticism, which you must have dealt with many times, that these sorts of activities, and I'm not just thinking about the sort of more entrepreneurial ones, but the reconstruction of the old city in Kabul, where the Aga Khan Foundation did some, to my mind, absolutely fantastic work. But what is your answer to those who say look, this is all very nice, but it's just not really important by comparison with the other challenges that people are facing in these environments.
Well, look, but perhaps we give some fairly biased responses here by virtue of our interest in these areas. But what I'd mentioned in my talk was that we have cast our eye over a very wide range of different types of development intervention. And I put those separately from humanitarian aid and intervention. So development programming in areas like education, in livelihoods programs, agricultural programs, and so on. And when I think of the impacts that I've seen for those types of programs compared to the very tangible, sustainable impacts that result from investments in cultural restoration projects, they pale in comparison. And one of the reasons for that, if we take an example from Kabul, there is the garden, Babur's garden, Bahi Babur, that is a 16th century mobile pleasure garden. It was restored, I think, over 10 years ago now, by the Aga Khan Foundation, or the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, sorry. That employed a huge number of people in its reconstruction. It involved upskilling of local workforce in traditional craft, and it currently employs lots of people to run it. There are other sites in Kabul just like that. And wherever these sites are built, there are all sorts of positive knock-on benefits to the local area. Restaurants and cafes spring up very quickly. Local trade is boosted and stimulated. And I think there's another really important angle here that Flore had touched on a moment ago, which is that sense of pride and identity that you get from investing in something as iconic as a minaret or a mosque or a garden, that you simply don't get with the best will in the world when you plant a USAID sign on a gender-based value chain exercise in a remote province. Those are important, but they don't have that same kind of cachet that I think a cultural program has.
Yeah, I really agree with Jonathan on the difference that we have to make between humanitarian support and development support. And I think Dan touched a bit on it at the beginning of his presentation when we were doing this work for UNESCO and evaluating their work in emergencies. I went to Mali evaluating UNESCO's role in this community where you had some basically inter-community fights, and that resulted in lots of death. And when UNESCO came in to understand what happened to the different masks and the Dogon mask and the amulets and the different items that this community was holding on as a cultural heritage, people just thought it was completely out of place. It wasn't relevant, and people needed water, people needed food, people needed shelter. So in a way, I would tend to agree with people who say culture comes a bit later or in parallel, but I wouldn't agree with culture coming first when you're in these kind of conditions.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, it's essentially, it's very important. It's just about how you prioritize it against other priorities. And of course, in a humanitarian response, emergency setting, food, water, shelter, security, sanitation should come before asking people, as Flore mentioned, about their masks and their intangible or tangible forms of heritage. But our research has found is that all countries mandate UNESCO and their partners to promote and continue to work in this sphere because it is important. And we can see the effects of how in how culture is being used as a weapon, not only in Afghanistan, but in Iraq, in Syria. We've seen what happened when the Notre Dame in Paris, human-induced disaster, what happened for the people there in Paris, people crying on the streets of Paris, responding to how important these built or intangible forms of heritage are important to them because of their significance. So we cannot say that it's not important, but we have to be mindful about the timing, and that's when the intervention timetable is very important to be mindful of.
Thank you very much. going to pick up a couple of questions here from participants online. First, William Crawley, thank you very much. William asked, when architectural heritage has been destroyed either by natural disaster or man-made conflict, how do international organizations mediate the sometimes conflicting cultural traditions? We tend to privilege one tradition or one historical period over another. Is exact or complete reconstruction always the best answer? Witness the parts of the Notre Dame discussion where apparently elements may be redesigned.
I love this question. It's a great one, and one that occupied a lot of my time when I was working with UNESCO. When the Buddhas, I can't speak particularly about Notre Dame, but speaking about the Buddhas specifically, there was this debate I alluded to earlier between a sort of Western tradition of reconstruction versus an Eastern understanding of integrity and authenticity. The Afghan government had asked for the Buddhas to be rebuilt fairly early on after they were blown up. And it is testament to the depth of feeling on both sides of that debate that, what is it now, 17 years later, they haven't been rebuilt. And although, you know, there has been some fierce discussion about whether they should or shouldn't be rebuilt, you know, taking a step back or casting our eyes back over history, how do we judge societies that hadn't rebuilt cities that were destroyed by invading armies? Bal wasn't rebuilt after Genghis Khan leveled it, nor indeed was Shari Golgola in the middle of Bamiyan. They become, no matter what the action is, a record of the way that we as a society think about ourselves and think about our past. So I don't really have a strong feeling on whether things should or shouldn't be rebuilt. I sort of am personally relieved that it seems unlikely a plastic Buddha will be built in the Buddha niche, but had one been built, I think 1,000 years from now, that would simply be in and of itself an interesting social commentary.
Thank you, Jonathan. I mean, I don't know if Flore or Daniel want to say anything about that. I have a couple of other questions, so I'll ask one of them now, and if you want to pick up on elements from that last one, please do. I mean, what is your view, asks one of our participants, what is your view on preventive actions such as 3D scanning of significant pieces of cultural heritage?
Yes, I'm happy to take this question. So when we were doing this work for UNESCO, we had a huge focus on digital tools and digital tools for prevention and digital tools for response. And there are more and more tools appearing. So you have 3D scanning, you have satellite imagery, you have drone footage, drone and image analysis. And my view on it is it's important to do it. It's important to do it because you never know what will happen to that piece. It's important to do it in a time where you can actually access that particular piece or object or element, architectural elements, because it might disappear. What's crucial though when you're doing it is making sure that the quality of the results matches or tries to match as much as possible the actual artifact, because otherwise that can lead to other discussions around what you're reproducing, what is the result that is being showed in museums and out there for the wider audience. And there are lots and lots of organizations doing, including UNESCO, but also small organizations doing preventive work. For example, in Syria, where they're going in areas where the conflict is not as it's not an ongoing conflict, and it's zone where they know there is some object that needs protection, and so they can deploy a group of scientists, of researchers that can document these elements for just history and the future.
I would just quickly add to that, completely concur with Flore. That's part of our findings for our research. But an element that came up that was quite interesting for us was the element of data storage. So once you have all of these images, and once you have all of this excellent material in place that should help you in the event of an emergency situation, you would think that it's properly stored, it's properly shared, it's put up to the right channels, and it's shared across the organizations, but it's not necessarily the case. So once you have it, the act of quality data storage becomes a challenge for some of these organizations, and they have to work through that. It's just something that came up, and I think it's important for them to address.
Thank you very much. I mean, there's a supplement to that that last question, which is whether you could elaborate on the protection of intangible cultural heritage in that context. It's you're obviously you can't scan that.
And there is different ways. So there is the digitalization of intangible cultural heritage, which Dan touched upon in his presentation, of course. But there's also at least what we're doing, which is making sure that the objects are being, if it's objects which are more crafts, that are being traded and used and bought. So it still sort of is a living intangible cultural heritage. There's other ways, which is more recording music. There are lots of different ways where you can actually preserve intangible cultural heritage.
And I think you know, another way, of course, that we've seen a lot of is festivals and activities. These are the lived culture of music festivals, of film festivals, even of sort of market development programs that support the development of enterprises and small businesses that, you know, put on entertainment, whether it's a papier-mâché puppet show in Kabul, or whether it's a calligraphy business. You know, there are all sorts of different ways of stimulating and fostering intangible cultural heritage that we've seen.
Just as to add on, and perhaps wasn't fully explained as part of my presentation earlier in the case of Lombok, but essentially, as you can imagine, the patterns, the weaving is all in the minds of these tremendous women that are working there. And of course, one of the project activities was to train them on some of the computer software to digitize the patterns so that these can be preserved, so that they can be passed along to generations without the need of it being passed along orally. And so this had some success. As you can imagine, they found some difficulties in training some of the elderly women in the communities using computer software, but they've had more success with some of the younger generation, teaching them how to do this as a means to bringing them back into the cultural community to show the importance of it. So they're trying to demonstrate that the weaving is not just about weaving itself. There are other elements that you can be involved in, for example, the business side of the digitization, the Instagram postings. So there's different ways to involve different parts of the community in that process, but digitization was a big part of it.
Michael, you mute.
Apologies, I was muted. I was going to say, I am just going to ask Richard Wilding to come in on this, because the recording and conservation of cultural heritage is very much Richard's own area of practice. I mean, Richard, could you comment on these questions as well?
I'm not sure I have anything to comment on the question just then, but I'm happy to talk a bit more about my projects if you'd like.
Yeah, please do.
Well, I suppose there's three specific things I've been involved in that are relevant to what the panelists are talking about. One is a group that I work with in Saudi Arabia called Mansujat. And Mansujat was founded by a group of Saudi women to preserve their costumes, the traditional costumes of Arabia. And I've been working with Mansujat for many years. I'm a trustee of the charity, which is based in the UK because it's problematic, having a charity like this based in Saudi Arabia itself. And we together have documented the costumes of all regions of Saudi Arabia. And this is quite a sensitive area because it touches obviously on women's identity, but also on tribal identity, which is a sensitive topic in that country. And this has been really quite an effort to document this and produce a book, which is finally being published this summer, I'm pleased to say. And so that was one particular project, which goes back to my original question, I think, connecting to cultural appropriation and sensitivity around working with a culture which is not your own, and yet you feel a strong connection with. I don't want to suffer from the Lawrence of Arabia complex, where you associate yourself so much with someone else's identity and culture that you start to feel as if you're actually making decisions on behalf of those people themselves, and it's a very sensitive issue. So that was one area. Another area I'm involved in, as Michael said earlier, is Iraqi Kurdistan and a charity called Gulen, which I'm creative director of, which promotes Kurdish culture. And I suppose the interesting thing in that area is that you're working with a culture of a non-state entity. And again, this raises a whole load of sensitive issues, dealing with a region which is not a state, when larger organizations like UNESCO are largely based on the idea that they work with state entities and they work with the official boards for heritage of countries, as opposed to non-state entities like Iraqi Kurdistan. And so this has been an interesting area for me. And I've been photographing the heritage of Kurdistan before Daesh, post Daesh, obviously dealing with areas not just in Kurdistan, but also northern Iraq, which have been very heavily affected by that. And then the third thing, which I thought I'd mention, which Michael was referring to, is an initiative which I've established with a colleague of mine, Augustus Lurston. And this is Eye on Heritage. And we're working in post-conflict regions, particularly at the moment in Syria and Iraq. And we are working with local filmmakers to document intangible cultural heritage, music, poetry, which has been so badly disrupted by extremism, sectarianism in these regions. And we have set up a media center to document on video this very fragile culture. And we've set up a building just over the border in Turkey, in Urfa, and we've got amazing content coming out of it, which we're putting it on Facebook and on our website, Eye on Heritage. And this is something which is really just beginning now, and is hopefully going to grow.
Richard, thank you very much. I mean, those are all very pertinent, I think, to the sorts of issues that we've been discussing. And I mean, there's one thread in particular that Hookie Walker has picked up on. It's it is the question, it's related to the question of well, cultural appropriation perhaps, but certainly how far one's own sense of priorities should get involved in this sort of reconstruction. He asks particularly about assistance given by the United Arab Emirates with the reconstruction of the Grand Mosque in Mosul. There is potential for clashing of or combining of objectives there. To what extent do you think that that sort of combined intervention should be encouraged?
Well, I can't speak with experience or knowledge about the situation in Mosul, but I mean, what I would say is those projects focusing on culture that have been embedded within a deeper development initiative have tended to succeed and be more sustainable than those that haven't, and vice versa. Those economic development programs or market development or livelihoods programs that have been couched in cultural development areas have tended to be more sustainable than those I have seen that haven't been. I mentioned earlier very briefly a project I was looking at that was actually being run by the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, and in conjunction to restoring a part of Kabul, another pleasure garden, a 19th century one this time called Chir Satun. They trained a whole lot of young people in those traditional crafts. They encouraged, so there's a whole vocational training division there that they've set up. Young people are being trained in these new skills. They're finding employment in the reconstruction and development of these sites. And of course, those spin-off businesses that I alluded to earlier, the shops, the cafes, and so on that spin up around these places are there. So, I think culture and development should be integrated, or broader development initiatives should be integrated as much as possible. And that's closely linked to, the need to deliver immediate tangible benefits, because we talked about prioritizing, certain things, be it access to electricity, roads, whatever else it might be. It's all very well saying to somebody, well, this bit of culture is fantastically interesting and important and old and beautiful and what have you. But understandably, faced with other really, really quite profound challenges, it's very difficult to sort of get behind any of these broader developments unless they're closely linked together.
Thank you. I'm going to a couple of other questions, and then we're probably coming to the end of our time. But one, Arlene Fleming says, isn't it imperative that first responders in disaster situations know how to secure cultural heritage places whenever possible? Shouldn't cultural heritage be integrated into humanitarian response? I suspect your answers are going to be some nuanced form of yes, but let me let you answer it yourselves.
You're exactly right, Michael. It's a nuanced yes. And, objective 2 of UNESCO's 2015 strategy is essentially that, to work with humanitarian, peace-building, peacekeeping, security forces globally to ensure that they have heritage, culture, intangible or tangible forms of culture on the agenda in these emergency scenarios. Now, they have a number of preparedness-oriented activities that they do with the military, with humanitarian actors, to ensure that what they call first aid in culture is secured. They have struggled, of course, to get these, that culture on the agenda. They did succeed in Mali for a period of time in which it was on the peacekeeping agenda, and therefore, when there was an attack in certain areas, the peacekeeping forces were obliged to try to secure that site or that intangible form of heritage. Having said that, it's not always the case. And my answer to this would be, yes, it's important, but it's about prioritization again in regards to the emergency situation. It's difficult to ask the soldiers, to give an hypothetical example, to secure first a cultural heritage site before securing the security of the people themselves.
Thank you. Let me move on. I think this is probably the last question we can take, but it's connected with those last two sets of points. From Philip Punada, does UNESCO or do other bodies coordinate or fund NGO social science research in the regions around heritage sites to determine the attitudes of locals? Obviously, he says, tourist commerce is often a major motivator, but beyond that, how do we know what the locals think about preservation efforts?
Well, I can answer that reasonably succinctly from my own experience and say that no, they don't. And the work, that's not to say that communities aren't consulted and engaged with, but I tend to think that what I've seen is, I think, a comparatively narrow form of engagement. And that might be big sort of town hall style meetings where you gather local people together in the center of town and you sort of present what you're trying to do, what you're trying to protect in the local area and so on. There might, in addition to that, be an awful lot of informal engagement with local communities going on all the time through project managers, through experts, working on sites, engaging with people who come up and talk to the sites. But what I haven't seen is anything like the same kind of community consultation that goes into, for instance, infrastructure development, where you would, as a matter of course, conduct something called a social or environmental impact assessment. And you would go out, you would outsource to a company like mine, Anna Strategies. You would go out and you get a company to go out and speak to people all over the place, and do it in a very impartial manner to gather as many views as you possibly can in a quantitative way, a survey essentially, to really understand what people think about the potential impacts of a mine or a road or any kind of development. And I think the same thing should be happening for sites in Afghanistan and elsewhere. I think there should be as much engagement, whether it's through a company like mine or anybody else, with those communities as humanly possible, and to develop a robust evidence-based for discussions about what is important and what is not important, and specifically what is culture and what isn't culture. I mean, after all, a baked potato or a manner of baking a potato can be a form of intangible cultural heritage, but let's get a real sense of what people do prioritize and what they think is important compared to, whether we think it might be brightly colored clothes or something. There are various forms that we probably miss without doing these kinds of studies.
I would be really curious to adding to John's point, and we have friends who've done research, PhDs on these particular topics, but I would be really curious to know what is being done in Paris, where I come from, around cultural heritage and what needs to be preserved, and what kind of discussions they're having with the locals, the Parisians. I think it's always important to just compare what is being done here where we are living in London and around the UK and in Afghanistan, and not having a specific developed sort of methodology for places abroad or away, and having the same methodology that is being applied in Paris, for instance.
Thank you very much indeed. And I think the baked potato is perhaps the moment where we should say we are going to close the discussion. We are unfortunately pretty much out of time. It's been a fascinating discussion, and it clearly could have gone on for some time yet. So thank you very much, Jonathan, Daniel, Flore, Richard, for all of that. A recording of this will be available on the RSAA's YouTube channel later this evening, and if you've missed any other of our recent events, you can catch up on those too. Next Wednesday, Dr. Noel Breheny will join us to talk about nationalism in South Yemen. Many of you may know that Noel is a great expert on Yemen, having been deeply involved in its affairs and history for many years. The invitation to his talk has gone out while we have been online, so please look out for that, and we hope to see you again next week. Once again, many thanks to our presenters and our audience. Goodbye.